The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the bustling diner as customers filled the worn leather booths, their laughter and chatter blending with the clatter of plates and silverware. It was a busy morning, and the energy inside was as warm and inviting as the golden sunlight streaming through the large front windows. At first glance, everything seemed picture-perfect, a cozy spot where locals gathered for a hearty breakfast and a smile from the staff. But beneath the surface of this charming scene, tensions were quietly simmering, about to bubble over in a way no one could have predicted. Behind the counter, a waiter briskly wiped down the surface, his movements sharp and deliberate. His demeanor, however, was anything but welcoming. He wore an expression of irritation, his lips pressed tightly together, as he occasionally threw curt glances at certain patrons. To those who had worked with him long enough, this was nothing new. He had a reputation, one that lingered in hushed whispers among coworkers and in awkward interactions with certain customers. Some chalked it up to him just having strong opinions, but others knew better. His attitude toward anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of acceptable was clear, and it was only a matter of time before it landed him in trouble. The bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of a new customer. Heads turned briefly to see a woman step in, her presence immediately commanding attention, not because she was loud or ostentatious, but because there was something effortlessly graceful about her. She moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made people take notice. Her dark hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her outfit, though simple, spoke of understated elegance. She glanced around, offering a polite smile to those who met her gaze, before settling into a corner booth. The waiter's eyes narrowed as he spotted her. He stiffened, his lips curling into a barely concealed sneer. She didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she chose not to, as she busied herself pulling a small notebook from her bag. But to him, her very presence was an affront. He muttered something under his breath as he picked up a menu and stalked toward her table. From across the room, a man sitting at another booth observed the scene unfold. He was a regular at the diner, well known among the staff for his friendly demeanor and generous tips. Today, though, his usual easygoing expression was replaced with one of quiet concern. He had noticed the waiter's behavior before, subtle microaggressions, dismissive tones, and jokes that were anything but funny. And now, it seemed, the woman in the corner booth was the waiter's latest target. "Morning," the waiter said flatly as he reached her table, dropping the menu in front of her with an audible thud. There was no warmth in his voice, no trace of the courteous tone he used with other customers. "What'll it be?" The woman looked up, her expression calm but slightly puzzled by his abrupt manner. "I'll need a moment, thank you," she replied politely, her voice steady. The waiter scoffed, muttering something under his breath again. It was just loud enough for her and a few nearby patrons to hear, but the words were mumbled, leaving an air of plausible deniability. Still, the intent was clear, and it made the atmosphere in the diner shift ever so slightly. A few customers exchanged uneasy glances, while others pretended not to notice, focusing intently on their coffee cups or newspapers. The woman, however, didn't flinch. She held his gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable, before returning her attention to the menu. The waiter lingered for a beat longer, as if expecting a reaction, but when none came, he turned on his heel and stalked back to the counter. "What's his problem?" a customer whispered to her friend, glancing nervously in the woman's direction. "No idea," the friend replied. "But he's been like that with certain people. You'd think someone would have done something by now." As the minutes ticked by, the woman placed her order and settled into her booth, seemingly unbothered by the waiter's frosty attitude. But the regular at the other booth couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He kept an eye on the interaction, noting how the waiter seemed to go out of his way to ignore her, attending to other tables while delaying her order. When he finally did bring her food, it was with a dismissive clatter of the plate, and barely a word. The tension reached a tipping point when the woman quietly flagged down the manager, a kind-hearted, middle-aged man who had owned the diner for years. The regular leaned forward in his seat, straining to hear the conversation but catching only fragments. The woman's tone was calm, measured, but there was a firmness to her words that suggested she wasn't someone to be brushed off easily. The manager nodded, his expression growing serious as he listened. He shot a glance toward the waiter, who was now loitering near the kitchen, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind him. The manager excused himself from the table and approached the counter, his steps purposeful. What happened next was nothing short of a revelation, and it left the entire diner stunned. The regular couldn't have predicted the twist that was about to unfold, but one thing was clear: the waiter's behavior was about to catch up with him in a way he never expected. And when the truth came to light, it would leave everyone questioning just how well they really knew the people around them. The manager walked up to the counter, his face tight with concern. He called the waiter over in a low but firm voice, his tone leaving no room for argument. The waiter hesitated, glancing around as if hoping for some excuse to avoid the conversation. When none presented itself, he reluctantly stepped closer, his posture defensive. "What's going on?" the manager asked, keeping his voice calm but pointed. "Is there a problem with the woman in the corner booth?" The waiter shrugged, feigning indifference. "Nothing. She's just particular, I guess." The manager narrowed his eyes. "Particular? Or are you being rude again?" "Because I've heard complaints about this before, and I won't let it slide anymore." "Come on," the waiter said, rolling his eyes. "You always jump to conclusions." "I'm doing my job like everyone else." The manager didn't buy it. He had been running this diner long enough to know when something wasn't right. His staff were like family to him, but that didn't mean he turned a blind eye to bad behavior. He glanced over at the woman, who was calmly sipping her coffee, seemingly unfazed by the unfolding drama. But her composure only made the manager more determined to get to the bottom of things. "You've been warned about this before," the manager said, his tone firmer now. "I won't have anyone mistreated in my diner, do you understand? If I hear one more complaint, fine," the waiter snapped, cutting him off. "Whatever. Can I get back to work now?" The manager frowned but nodded, knowing he couldn't force the waiter to take accountability in the moment. As the waiter turned away, the regular who had been observing the situation felt a knot of frustration tighten in his chest. He wanted to speak up, to tell the manager everything he had seen, but he hesitated. The timing didn't feel right. Instead, he decided to wait and see how things played out. Meanwhile, the woman in the corner booth had finished her meal and was gathering her belongings. She glanced at her watch, then reached into her bag to pull out her wallet. As she placed her payment on the table, the door to the kitchen swung open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with a commanding presence and a kind face that immediately put people at ease. The regular recognized him instantly, the diner's owner. Though he didn't come in every day, his appearances were always memorable. He had a way of making everyone feel valued, from the kitchen staff to the customers. The owner's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on the woman. A smile spread across his face, and he made his way over to her booth with an air of familiarity. The regular watched in fascination as the woman's face lit up at the sight of him. "You didn't tell me you'd be stopping by today," the owner said warmly as he approached her. "I wanted to surprise you," she replied, her tone just as warm. "Besides, I needed a change of scenery. It's been a busy week." Their exchange was easy and natural, full of the kind of comfort that came from years of knowing each other. It didn't take long for the regular and several other patrons to piece together the connection. This wasn't just any customer, she was the owner's wife. The realization hit like a bolt of lightning, and suddenly, the tension in the room took on a whole new meaning. The waiter, still lingering near the counter, froze as he noticed the interaction. His face paled, and he seemed to shrink into himself. He hadn't made the connection before, but now it was impossible to ignore. The woman he had been rude to, the one he had dismissed so callously, was married to the very man who signed his paychecks. The regular couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. For too long, the waiter had gotten away with his behavior, hiding behind thin excuses and vague denials. But now, there was no escaping the consequences. He watched as the owner and his wife continued their conversation, oblivious to the growing unease radiating from the waiter. As the woman prepared to leave, the owner turned to her with a question. "How was everything today? Did the staff take good care of you?" She hesitated for the briefest moment, her eyes flickering toward the counter where the waiter stood. Her expression remained neutral, but the pause spoke volumes. Finally, she said, "Most of the staff were wonderful, as always. But there was an issue with one of them." The owner's brow furrowed. "An issue? What kind of issue?" The woman glanced at the waiter again, her gaze calm but direct. "It's something we should discuss later," she said softly, not wanting to cause a scene in front of the other customers. "But it's important." The owner nodded, his jaw tightening as he followed her gaze. He didn't press her for details, but the message was clear. Whatever had happened, it wouldn't be brushed under the rug. As the woman left the diner, the regular could feel the shift in the room. The easygoing atmosphere had been replaced by a tense silence, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. The owner turned toward the counter, his expression unreadable as he walked over to the manager. "Can we talk for a moment?" he asked quietly. The manager nodded, and the two men stepped into the back office, leaving the staff and customers to exchange uneasy glances. The regular's curiosity burned, but he knew better than to pry. Instead, he waited, wondering how the owner would handle the situation and whether the waiter would finally be held accountable for his actions. Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. When the owner and manager finally emerged from the office, their expressions were serious. The owner approached the waiter, who had been nervously fidgeting with a stack of napkins. "We need to talk," the owner said, his voice steady but firm. "Now." The waiter's face flushed, but he followed the owner into the office without a word. The door closed behind them, and the diner fell silent once more. The regular leaned back in his booth, a mix of anticipation and satisfaction swirling in his chest. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: the waiter was about to face the consequences of his actions. And for the first time in a long time, justice felt within reach. The door to the office remained shut, and the muffled sound of voices inside made the entire diner seem to hold its breath. Customers kept their conversations low, glancing toward the office with curiosity and unease. The regular stayed glued to his booth, his coffee long gone cold as he waited to see how things would unfold. A few of the waitstaff exchanged quiet whispers, their faces tight with tension. It was clear that everyone knew something significant was happening behind that closed door, but no one dared to say it out loud. Inside the office, the waiter stood with his arms crossed, trying to project an air of defiance. But the owner's steady gaze broke through the facade. The silence between them was heavy, the kind that forced every thought and memory to the surface. The waiter felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, but instead of owning up, he resorted to excuses. "I don't know what she told you," he began, his voice defensive. "But I didn't do anything wrong. She's just being sensitive." The owner raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but unyielding. "Sensitive? That's your explanation?" "Because from what I've heard, this isn't the first time there's been a complaint about your attitude." "That's not fair," the waiter shot back. "People complain about everything these days. I'm just trying to do my job." "Your job," the owner repeated, his tone sharp. "Your job is to treat every customer who walks through that door with respect. To make them feel welcome, no matter who they are. Is that what you've been doing?" The waiter opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel his pulse quicken as the owner continued, his voice growing more resolute. "I've trusted you to represent this diner, to be part of the team that makes it a place people want to come back to. And today, my wife, a woman you didn't even bother to treat with basic decency, had to sit here and feel unwelcome in her own husband's restaurant. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel?" The waiter's face flushed, and for the first time, his bravado cracked. He looked down at his feet, his mind racing for a way to salvage the situation. But before he could speak, the owner held up a hand to stop him. "This isn't about excuses or misunderstandings," the owner said firmly. "This is about respect, something you seem to have forgotten." Back in the diner, the regular noticed the tension spilling into the atmosphere. The waitstaff moved about quietly, their usual cheerful energy replaced by a subdued efficiency. Customers whispered to one another, their curiosity piqued by the unusual hush. It was as if the entire room could feel the gravity of what was happening. The manager, who had stayed outside the office to keep things running smoothly, approached the regular's booth. "Can I get you anything else?" he asked, his voice soft but strained. "No, I'm good," the regular replied. "Just waiting to see how this all plays out." The manager gave a tight nod. "You and me both." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The tension was almost unbearable, but no one dared to break it. The office door finally opened, and the waiter stepped out, his face pale and his posture slumped. He avoided meeting anyone's eyes as he walked briskly toward the back of the diner, disappearing into the kitchen. The owner followed shortly after, his expression unreadable as he scanned the room. His gaze lingered on the regular for a moment, as if gauging his thoughts, before he walked over to the counter and addressed the staff. "I need everyone to listen," the owner said, his voice carrying a calm authority that silenced the room. The waitstaff gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Even the customers leaned in slightly, unable to hide their interest. "This diner has always been a place where people come to feel welcome, no matter who they are," the owner began. "That's not just some nice-sounding motto, it's the heart of everything we do here. And if anyone can uphold that, they don't belong on this team." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The staff exchanged glances, their expressions somber. The regular felt a chill run through him. The owner's tone was calm, but the message was unmistakable. Things were about to change. As the staff dispersed, the regular couldn't resist asking the manager, "What's going to happen to him?" The manager sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's up to the boss," he said quietly. "But I think his time here is running out." The regular nodded, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't shake the memory of the waiter's behavior, the casual cruelty, the way he had dismissed the woman without a second thought. It was a stark reminder of how much harm could be done with just a few careless words. And now, it seemed, the waiter was finally being held accountable. But even as the regular felt a sense of justice, he couldn't help but wonder about the larger implications. How many other places allowed behavior like this to go unchecked? How many other people had to endure similar treatment, simply because no one was willing to stand up and say, "Enough"? The rest of the day passed in a strange, muted haze. The waiter never returned to the front of the house, and the owner kept a watchful eye on the diner, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the standards he expected. The regular eventually left, but the events of the day lingered in his mind long after he stepped outside. As the sun set and the diner's lights cast a warm glow on the sidewalk, the tension inside reached its peak. The remaining staff knew that the fallout from the day's events wasn't over yet. The waiter's absence spoke volumes, but the final word had yet to be spoken. And as the night wore on, everyone braced themselves for what was to come. As the evening rush began, the diner's usual hum of activity returned, but the undercurrent of tension was impossible to ignore. The regular had long since left, but a few patrons who had witnessed the earlier drama lingered, watching the staff with subtle curiosity. The waiter's absence was noticeable, and the remaining team worked quietly, their movements efficient but subdued. The owner remained in the front of the house, occasionally stepping behind the counter to help with orders. His presence felt heavier than usual, like a quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. It wasn't until the clock crept past 8 that the next surprise arrived. The bell above the door jingled, and a man in a sharp, dark suit stepped inside. He looked out of place among the casual diners, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor as he made his way toward the counter. The staff exchanged curious glances, but no one moved to greet him right away. There was something about his presence, calm yet commanding, that made them hesitate. The man looked around, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they landed on the owner. With a small, polite smile, he walked over and extended a hand. "Good evening. I'm looking for Mr. Patterson." "That's me," the owner replied, shaking the man's hand. "And you are?" The man handed him a business card. "Daniel Reed. I'm with Winston and Carter." The mention of the law firm made a few heads turn. Winston and Carter was a name everyone in the town knew, a powerhouse firm that handled everything from corporate disputes to personal lawsuits. The owner frowned slightly, glancing at the card before looking back at Daniel. "What can I do for you, Mr. Reed?" he asked, his tone cautious. "I'd like to discuss something with you in private, if you don't mind," Daniel said smoothly. "It concerns one of your employees." The staff tensed, and the manager, who had been wiping down the counter, froze mid-swipe. The owner hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Follow me," he said, leading Daniel toward the office. As the door closed behind them, the whispers started. The staff speculated in hushed tones, each theory more dramatic than the last. Was it about the waiter? Had the earlier incident triggered something bigger? The possibilities swirled, and the air grew thick with anticipation. Inside the office, the owner sat behind his desk while Daniel remained standing, his posture impeccable. "What's this about?" the owner asked, leaning forward slightly. Daniel placed a thin folder on the desk and opened it with deliberate care. "I'm here on behalf of a former employee," he began, his tone measured. "Specifically, the one who used to work your Wednesday night shifts, Maria Alvarez." The name hit like a jolt. Maria had been a waitress at the diner for nearly 3 years before leaving abruptly a few months ago. At the time, she had cited personal reasons for her departure, but there had been rumors of a dispute with the waiter. The owner hadn't pressed for details, assuming Maria wanted to move on quietly. Now, it seemed there was more to the story. "What about Maria?" the owner asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. Daniel slid a document across the desk. "She's filed a formal complaint. Claims of harassment, discrimination, and a hostile work environment, all tied to the same individual your wife encountered today." The weight of the words settled over the room like a heavy fog. The owner stared at the document, his jaw tightening as he processed the implications. "And why am I just hearing about this now?" he asked, his tone sharp. "She wanted to handle it quietly," Daniel explained. "Maria spoke to several people, but nothing was done. She felt she had no choice but to leave. However, after learning that this individual is still employed here and that similar incidents are ongoing, she decided it was time to take action." The owner leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought of all the times he had dismissed small complaints, assuming they were minor misunderstandings. He had trusted his staff to work out their differences, never imagining the problem ran this deep. And now, with his wife's experience fresh in his mind, he couldn't deny the pattern. "This is serious," he said finally, his voice heavy. "And I'm not going to let it slide. But I need time to figure out the best way to handle it." Daniel nodded, his expression professional but firm. "I understand. My client isn't looking to damage your reputation. She just wants accountability and assurances that no one else will go through what she did." The owner met his gaze, a flicker of resolve lighting in his eyes. "You have my word. I'll make this right." As Daniel left the office, the whispers in the diner grew louder. The staff watched him leave, their curiosity barely concealed, while the owner stepped out moments later, his expression grim. He gathered the team, his voice cutting through the noise. "I need everyone's attention," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I've just learned some things that can't be ignored, things about how we've been running this diner, and how certain people have been treated. Let me be clear, this ends now. I'm taking steps to ensure that this place is safe and welcoming for everyone, staff and customers alike. If anyone has something to say, now is the time." The room fell silent. No one moved, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The owner scanned their faces, his eyes lingering on each one before he turned and walked back to the office. The tension remained, but there was a new layer to it now, one of uncertainty and unease. The team couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the waiter sat on a stool, his head in his hands. He had overheard enough of the conversation to know that things were spiraling out of his control. For years, he had operated on the assumption that his actions would never catch up with him. Now, the walls were closing in, and he felt the ground shifting beneath him. The night dragged on, the energy in the diner charged with anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop, for the final confrontation that seemed inevitable. And as the clock ticked closer to closing time, the suspense reached its breaking point. The regular customers who had stayed late sensed the tension and exchanged knowing looks, wondering how much longer the storm could be held at bay. The night was thick with anticipation, the last few customers finishing their meals as the staff lingered in the background, each one keenly aware of the shifting atmosphere. The owner had promised change, but no one knew exactly how it would play out. The diner, once a place of quiet comfort, now felt like a battleground where everything was at stake. The waiter, still holed up in the kitchen, could feel the pressure mounting. He had been trying to figure out his next move, but nothing seemed to offer an easy escape. Every choice felt like it would be his last. As the clock struck 10, the diner was near empty. The last patrons filed out, leaving only the staff behind. The owner emerged from the office, his face grim. He didn't look at anyone, his gaze was locked on the kitchen, where the waiter still sat, brooding in his corner. The owner's footsteps echoed on the tile floor as he made his way toward the back, his resolve palpable. The staff watched in silence, the weight of what was about to unfold hanging in the air. The regular, who had returned to grab a final cup of coffee, felt the tension crawl under his skin. He could only imagine what kind of reckoning was coming for the waiter. Inside the kitchen, the waiter stood up as soon as he saw the owner enter. He tried to put on an air of calm but failed miserably. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the fear that was creeping in. The owner didn't waste time with pleasantries. His eyes were cold as he stepped closer. "We need to talk," the owner said, his voice quiet but filled with authority. The waiter swallowed, his throat dry. "I don't know what you think I did, but you don't get to explain it away this time," the owner interrupted. His voice didn't raise, but it carried the weight of years of trust broken. "I know exactly what you've done." The waiter took a step back, his mind racing. He had expected this, but the reality was harder to face. "It wasn't like that. I was just no," the owner cut him off. "It was exactly like that. You made my wife uncomfortable today. And you've done it before, to other employees. Maria, she wasn't the first one. You've been making people feel unsafe here, and I won't allow it." The words hit harder than the waiter expected. His face drained of color, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the full weight of his actions. The owner's eyes didn't leave him, unflinching. "You're not just a server here," the owner continued, his voice steady. "You're part of the team. And you've let the whole team down. I can't let you work here anymore." "I won't." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. The waiter opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. His mind was a mess, scrambling for any excuse, any way to avoid this moment, but it was too late. The damage was done. "I need you to leave," the owner said firmly. "Right now." The waiter stood there, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew this wasn't just about losing his job, it was about everything he had taken for granted. The relationships he had burned, the opportunities he had wasted. In one fell swoop, it was all crashing down. He had hoped he could skate by, that somehow he would escape the consequences of his actions. But the reality was unavoidable now. Without a word, the waiter turned and walked toward the back door. His movements were slow, as if every step was a final farewell to the life he had known. The kitchen doors swung shut behind him with a soft thud, and the owner stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle. The decision had been made. There was no going back. But as the owner turned to walk back to the front of the diner, something unexpected happened. The door to the kitchen opened again, but it wasn't the waiter returning. It was the manager. He walked up to the owner with a look of concern. "There's something you need to know," the manager said, his voice low. "Something that just came up." The owner raised an eyebrow, waiting for the explanation. The manager hesitated, glancing around before leaning in slightly. "It's about the lawsuit. Maria. She didn't just file complaints here. She's been talking to the press. There's already a story in the works. The firm she's working with is planning to go public with everything." The words hit the owner like a slap. He felt a rush of blood to his face as a wave of anger and disbelief surged through him. "She's what? Why the hell would she go to the press?" "I don't know," the manager said, shaking his head. "But it's bad. The whole thing's going to get blown up. All of it. The incident with the waiter, the complaints, everything. It's bigger than we thought." The owner felt the walls closing in again, but this time, it wasn't just about his staff or his diner, it was about everything he had worked for. His reputation, his business, everything. It was all suddenly at risk. "What do we do?" the owner asked, his voice tight. The manager shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. But we need to act fast. We can't let this get out of control." As the weight of the situation pressed down on him, the owner's mind raced. He had wanted to fix things, to right the wrongs, but now he was faced with something much bigger than he anticipated. A lawsuit, a press scandal, all of it threatening to destroy everything he had built. He could feel the ground slipping beneath him. Just as he was about to speak, the diner door opened again, and a familiar face stepped inside. It was Maria. She looked calm, almost too calm, and she walked straight up to the counter, her eyes meeting the owner's with a quiet resolve. "I think we need to talk," she said, her voice steady but sharp. The owner froze. He hadn't expected this. He had assumed Maria would just let the legal team handle things, but here she was, standing right in front of him, as if daring him to face the consequences. "What is it you want?" the owner asked, his voice a mix of frustration and disbelief. Maria's eyes flickered to the manager, then back to the owner. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen again," she said quietly. "But I also want to make sure you understand that this isn't just about what happened with the waiter. It's about what's been happening here for a long time." The owner stared at her, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I get it. I do," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I'll fix it. I promise." But as Maria turned to leave, she paused by the door, glancing back over her shoulder. "Just remember," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Sometimes, the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. And sometimes, the ones who think they're in control end up losing everything." With that, she was gone, leaving the owner standing alone, the weight of her words sinking in deeper than he expected. The diner, once a haven of comfort and routine, now stood on the edge of something much larger than anyone could have imagined. And as the door closed behind her, the owner realized that the real battle had only just begun. The door closed with a soft click, and the room felt suddenly smaller, more suffocating. The owner stood motionless, staring at the spot where Maria had just been. Her words echoed in his mind, sharper than anything he had expected. She wasn't just asking for accountability for the waiter's actions, she was exposing a much deeper issue that had been festering under the surface of the diner for far too long. The manager shifted uneasily beside him, breaking the silence. "What now?" The owner turned slowly, his face a mask of exhaustion and determination. He knew there was no easy way forward. The diner was on the brink of collapse both from a legal standpoint and from the loss of trust that now loomed over it. But he wasn't going to let it all slip away. Not without trying. "I'll do whatever it takes to make it right," he said quietly, his voice firm. "I'll talk to the staff. I'll talk to Maria. I'll do what I should have done a long time ago, fix this." The manager nodded slowly, but there was a lingering doubt in his eyes. He had seen the way the public turned on places in the past. A scandal like this wasn't easy to come back from. But he could see the resolve in the owner's eyes, and he understood that this wasn't just about saving the diner, it was about salvaging what was left of their integrity. "I'll start making some calls," the manager said. "I'll reach out to the lawyer who's been handling Maria's case, try to make sure everything's in order. It's going to be a rough road ahead, but we'll need to face it head on." The owner nodded, then turned to leave the office. He walked to the dining area, where the few remaining staff members were cleaning up the last tables. They all looked up at him as he approached, waiting for him to speak. Their faces were tense, some with curiosity, others with anxiety. The weight of the moment was palpable. "I've got something to say," the owner began, his voice steady. "And I need you to listen." The room fell quiet, and the staff gathered around him, each one looking expectantly. The owner took a deep breath before continuing. "I've made mistakes. We've all made mistakes. But this behavior, the things that have been happening behind the scenes, it can't go on. I've been too lenient, too trusting. And I've ignored the signs that we were creating an environment where people didn't feel safe, didn't feel respected." He looked at each of them, his gaze intense but sincere. "I'm sorry. From now on, things are going to change. We're going to have open conversations. We're going to make sure that everyone who works here feels valued. No more ignoring the small things, no more letting things slide. This is a fresh start." The room was still, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was no immediate applause or cheering, but there was a sense of something being acknowledged. The staff was ready to move forward, ready to rebuild trust, even if it would take time. The owner's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced down to see a message from the lawyer Maria had been working with. It was a simple text, but it carried weight. "Meeting tomorrow. Let's discuss terms." He sighed, putting the phone away. The legal battle ahead would be just as challenging as the one within his own walls. But at least now, he knew the steps he needed to take. This was bigger than a single employee's misdeeds. This was about building a culture where respect and accountability weren't just words but actions. The diner had always been a community gathering place. He realized now that it was time to foster that same sense of respect and care within the team. The next day was a blur of meetings, phone calls, and legal discussions. Maria's lawyer was firm but fair, and the owner did his best to assure them that he was taking all the necessary steps to address the situation. He knew that his actions would determine whether the diner would survive this ordeal, not just in terms of finances, but in terms of its reputation. As the weeks went by, the changes at the diner were visible. The staff began to open up more with one another, sharing their concerns and ideas. They instituted regular meetings to address any issues before they escalated. The owner even set up a feedback system for customers to voice their experiences, ensuring that no one was ever in the position where they felt powerless or unheard. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild, not just between the staff, but with the community as well. Maria's case remained a constant presence, but it became clear that her goal had always been accountability, not vengeance. The diner's reputation took a hit, but it didn't collapse entirely. There were no major headlines, no viral scandals, just a gradual, steady process of change. And for the first time in months, the owner felt a sense of peace. He knew that the road ahead would still be rocky, that there would be challenges, but he was ready to face them. He had learned something important: the strength of a business wasn't just in its profits, it was in the people who made it what it was. And he was willing to fight for them. The waiter, on the other hand, had left town shortly after that night. His future was uncertain, and while there was no public closure for him, the diner had already started to move on. The weight of his actions had caught up with him in a way he never anticipated, and there was little sympathy for him from those who had been affected by his behavior. His departure felt like an end to one chapter, but the beginning of another for the rest of the staff. As the months passed, the diner began to regain its footing. It wasn't an instant turnaround, and there were moments when the owner questioned whether the damage could truly be undone. But in time, the community began to trust them again, to believe in the changes they had worked so hard to implement. And then one evening, as the sun set over the small town and the diner buzzed with activity, the owner stood by the counter, watching the familiar scene unfold. The laughter, the clinking of silverware, the quiet hum of everyday life, it was the same as it had always been. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt earned. The owner looked around the room, at his staff, at the customers who had been coming in faithfully through the storm. And he realized that the diner, like any good community, wasn't perfect. But it was theirs. It was real. And no matter what had happened in the past, it was now up to them to make sure it was a place where everyone, no matter who they were, could feel at home. The journey wasn't over, but the next chapter was starting to feel a lot more hopeful. And that, in itself, was a victory.